Thank you. Yeah. Great. Good. Yeah. Good. What did you say? I'll definitely tell you in Spanish. Oh, so you were able to talk to them. I mean, it was more like, like I was there. Asking how do you say something, asking how do you say this in Spanish. It was just running the whole through. Like me losing hold of romance. Oh no.
How do I deal with volume and that kind of thing?
They're just chit-chatting right now, so nobody's speaking into the mic. Bill, I wouldn't worry about it until they actually start.
It was something I got. We do. Are we having a start? We're going to start. Oh, yeah.
Hello, good afternoon, and good evening or good morning from wherever you are. This is Brown Mujeta here speaking. Thank you everybody for being here and for coming. Can you all hear me okay? Yes, awesome. Good to hear. I'm honored and delighted to have you here and to introduce our speakers for today. Introducing Ben Dandelion. He's a programs leader for the Center of Research in Quaker Studies at Woodbrook and a professor of Quaker Studies at the University of Birmingham. He'll be speaking to us in a few. Also, David Harrington Watt, the Douglas and Dorothy Steele Professor of Quaker Studies at Harvard College. And finally, Stephen W. Angell is our very own Leatherock Professor of Quaker Studies here at the Elam School of Religion. What a joy and a blessing to have this team here with us. Without further ado, I would like to pass it on to Ben to start off for us.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you very much for this invitation for the three of us to talk to you about our recent volume, The Creation of Modern Quaker Diversity. What I want to do in my part of this presentation is to put the book in the context of the series that it's in the context of wider Quaker scholarship. So there's a lovely article by Thomas Ham, reprinted in The Creation of Modern Quaker Theory, which really suggests that kind of modern Quaker studies, as it were, began in probably the 1870s, where evangelical scholars like William Tallack and Robert Berkeley of Reigate in Surrey in England presented the history of Quakerism through their own evangelical lens to justify the current Quaker sensibilities of the time. Great, huge works. It's William Tallack that first coins the phrase quietist for the 18th century. Robert Berkeley of Reigate writes about 500 pages before he even gets to the Quakers. It's all about the early Quaker context and the seekers and the levelers and the diggers, the societies of the Commonwealth. So, but and those histories stand, and it's really, though, at the beginning of the 20th century that we see the next great historical Quaker studies venture. And this is the dream, I think it's fair to say, of John Wilhelm Rowntree and Rufus Jones, who have met in Switzerland in 1897 in Mürren, and who have quickly become very close friends and colleagues in their venture to really reform and revitalize modernist Quakerism. And key to that project, and it builds on the experience of the Manchester Conference in England in 1895 and the summer schools that follow it. Key to this project is the idea of education. That if Quakers only knew their past in an appropriate way, then their spiritual life, the spiritual life of the society, would be renewed. And what we see is this great liberal venture around education. The summer schools every year, including one at Haverford, but often in Yorkshire, where the Rowntree family are based, one at Woodbrook, the home of George Cadbury. And then you get a kind of permanent summer school with the establishment of Woodbrook College in 1903. The building you might be able to see over my shoulder in the poster here. So you get also the beginning of the Swarthmore Lecture Series for Friends in Britain to reinterpret the message of the society for the next generation. But their other big venture, and probably the one that stays with us most closely, is the 7 volumes of what gets called the Rowntree History Series. John Wilhelm Rowntree dies tragically in 1905. He's buried in Haverford next to Rufus Jones. And the series, the idea of the series and the work of the series is carried on by Rufus Jones and William Charles Braithwaite, and a sea of often unnamed assistants and helpers. So 7 volumes published by Macmillan. The blue-bound books you may well find in your local meeting house library. The beginnings of Quakerism, the second period of Quakerism, the later periods of Quakerism, volumes 1 and 2. I think probably unmatched in the depth of research that was able to be carried out at that time, particularly with this school of assistants, but with a very clear agenda that was to really position Quakerism as collective mysticism, Rufus Jones's key theme, and to really direct readers to a reading of Quakerism in those terms. And things that Rufus Jones didn't like, he was pretty clear about saying that was, not a strong period of Quakerism or not a good emphasis. And what we see running through this is a very clear agenda. And Alice Southern, more recently, in her master's work republished in the journal Quaker Studies, has offered a really good overview of how this agenda runs through this set of histories published between 1911 and 1922. So it's a major venture, it's a standard work, but even before Rufus Jones's death, people are beginning to question that take on Quaker history. And when some of the volumes are reprinted in the 1950s, those by William Charles Braithwaite, Rufus Jones's introduction to those volumes is removed and replaced by something by Hugh Doncaster, saying, well, we know more now, or things have moved on. And so what's changed is that there's a different scholarly emphasis, that the idea now is that Quakerism perhaps isn't best described as collective mysticism, but and doesn't have its lineage in the mystical movements before Quakerism, but rather in that ecumenical current of the mid-20th century, that Quakerism is best described as the culmination of the Radical Reformation. It's a kind of an extension of Puritanism. We see this in the work of Frederick Tolles. We see it in the work of Hugh Barber. So, and then later things will change. If we were to reprint that series now, we may have a different introduction. Perhaps we'd ask Doug Gwynn to write it, and it could offer an eschatological understanding of a prophetic Quakerism. So what happens with our book that sits within the new History of Quakerism series in Penn State Press? Well, in a way, the seeds of this series were a concern of Sylvia Stevens, whose work on Quakers in Northeast Norfolk has been really important in trying to better understand the 18th century. She came to the Conference of Quaker Historians and Archivists at Woodbrook, jointly with the Quaker Studies Research Association, in 2008, and said, we need to update these blue volumes. We know a lot more now. There's been a whole blooming of scholarship, particularly through PhD opportunities through the 90s and then the beginning of the 21st century. And these works no longer hold up to scholarly interrogation. So I think that was heard by that conference. The conference itself didn't have any means to really do much more. But what we find then is that Rosemary Moore and Richard Allen later take up that challenge and start putting together a collection around what we might call the second period of Quakerism, 1660s onwards. Now, I want to make the distinction. I think the Roundtree series is written for the benefit of Quakers. It's got a Quaker agenda, even though it's published by Macmillan. The new history series is an academic series which puts scholarship ahead of devotional preferences and affiliations. It's not got that same devotional agenda. Many of its contributors are not Quakers. It's been written by scholars. Now, Steve Angell and I were regular attenders at the American Academy of Religion, which has its own Quaker Studies unit, and we knew that Rosemary's work was Rosemary Moore's first work, The Light in Their Consciences, was about to be republished by Penn State Press. And in those kinds of conversations that are possible in person and over a cup of coffee, I think we were able to suggest that Penn State Press might like to take up Rosemary and Richard's second volume, if they hadn't already, but also that there may be a whole series that could emerge from the reprinting of Rosemary's first work and the work that Rosemary and Richard Allen were doing on the second period. And I think there's entrepreneurship both in the early 20th century with Macmillan, and there's entrepreneurship with these conversations at AAR, but perhaps this was a more organic scheme rather than the great vision of Rufus Jones and John Wilhelm Rowntree in Switzerland. And so this series has emerged over the last years. And in fact, Woodbrook is now running sessions on the different volumes. They're working through Rosemary's first volume at the moment, but we have the reprint, The Light in Their Consciences, 20th anniversary edition, 2021, and then quickly followed by the Quakers, 1656 to 1723, edited by Richard Allen and Rosemary Moore. And these other volumes are all edited ones. Robin Rogers Healy edited Quakerism and the Atlantic World, 1690 to 1830. And then Steve and David and myself set about the creation of modern Quaker diversity, 1830 to 1937. And since then, Robin Healy and Carol Spencer have also produced Quaker Women, 1800 to 1920, which builds on the work by Katie Gill and Michel Tata in their Oxford Press volume around Quaker women, 1650 to 1800. And just to round off the picture, that Steve, David, and I are now working on the volume that follows on from 1937. So there will, in the end, be 6 volumes in this series. So that's where it sits. There are different emphases through the volumes, but I think Stephen and David are going to say more about the actual book itself. But I just wanted to lay that out in context. Thank you very much.
I just wanted at this point to give you the table of contents of the book, and I got that on 2 different pages here. So there are 13 chapters plus an introduction and an afterword. There are different ways to do an anthology. Our method was to more or less set the topics and to invite scholars to address them. What you can figure from that is that we were aiming for a general coverage of the period. I hate to say such word as comprehensive, but a wide general. And we were very pleased, that virtually everybody we asked, maybe everybody, I'm not remembering, said yes. So, it really was a wonderful team of scholars to work with. If anybody were to ask me how it's possible that the friends of today, which I first said, could possibly have come from the friends of the 17th century, since the 2 groups of Quakers are so different, I would recommend this volume. Would be my top choice, because this period is really the crucible in which what looks like modern Quakers, wherever you look, geographically or in terms of all the different branches, comes out of this period in large part. Periodization, why 1830 to 1937? The previous volume with Robin Healy ended in 1830. It's also the death of Elias Hicks, 2 years after the Great Separation, that he had such a large part in bringing about. So it seemed a logical place to start. 1937 brings us to the second World Conference of Friends. In the aftermath of World War I, there was a series of All Friends conferences. 1937 was a important one, in which the Friends World Committee for Consultation was inaugurated out of that conference. Held at Haverford and Swarthmore colleges. It gives us, that this is not a usual periodization. This is sort of a new proposal on our part, but I think it has several advantages. One is that it includes significant parts of the career of important Quakers involved in the political arena, such as Herbert Hoover and Anazo Mutobi. And we have a wonderful chapter by Stephanie Midori Kamashin of the University of Hokkaido on Hoover, Mutobi, and John Bright, the really eminent parliamentarian in Britain in the 19th century, as well as Quakers in politics in general. There's some important transitions in the area of missions that happened in the 1930s, so we capture that. And it leaves for the next volume and the last volume the significant issues in the run-up to World War II and in World War II itself about Quaker conscientious objection and Friends relief work and humanitarian work in World War II, as well as all of the issues in the Cold War and in cultural wars that follow that. So that volume will be 1938 to 2018, I think we're calling it. This goes to 1937. Then, in his introduction, the remapping of Quakerism really very clearly puts forward, kind of a basic understanding of the period. And this is available online at the website of the Penn State University Press, so you can read Ben's introduction. But just briefly here, Ben talks about that this was a time when all the Quaker branches were inaugurated. So there are multiple Quakerisms, and that's something that all the authors clearly take in mind, and are strive, as Ben just said, to avoid bias, but to really work on a strong inclusion of all the various branches. The second point is that this is a time when Quakerism truly becomes a global thing. This is in the latter part of 19th century was when the missionary movement that came largely out of the Vernite tradition of Friends began, so Quakers become a global religion. As David Watt points out just afterward, the trajectory, even though this is not the case in 1937, but by 2024 and well before that, the majority, a rather large majority of Quakers live in the global south, and most Quakers live in Africa and Kenya now, more than any other region. And Ben's third point is that that during this period, Quakers evolved from a world denying to a world affirming faith, with increased involvement in politics, and they discarded Quaker peculiarity. Ben basically poses the question that Sylvester Johnson, really eminent scholar from Virginia Tech, and I work on collaboratively, and that is, was Quaker integrity compromised by conflict with empires of the global north, especially around questions of race? And you know, can that's not an absolutely clear-cut question, but we suggest reasons that might have been. Well, that's it. While the volume, you know, as I just laid it out, clearly aims to synthesize an overwhelming volume of scholarship that has arisen in recent decades, and we have more than 500 books that are complete bibliography. It also breaks ground in numerous areas. One chapter I'd like to quickly point out at this point is the one by Richard Kent Evans, David's colleague at Haverford, on Quakers and religious madness. In the sort of one sentence summary is in 1830, in the 1830s, Quakers were thought of as a particularly dangerous religious sect, that their practice of Quakerism would lead to religious madness. But the Quakers and those who were sympathetic to them in the 19th century did a rather sustained and successful campaign. And by the time William James rolled around in 1900, Quakers were seen as saner than any other religious sect. So Richard Evans describes it. I'd say two major emphases for the first third of the 21st century were service and missions. This the cover is the only photograph that we show. It's from a pretty early meeting, I think, Ben founded at Woodruff, but it depicts Quakers in Russia, Samara, Russia, in 1921. They're handing out food and clothing. British and American friends were in Samara, which is the area of Volga, east, a little bit south of Moscow, from 1965 to 1925. Numerous revolutions, counter-revolutions. There was a horrible famine caused by drought, but also by the depredations of all the various armies that were going through the area. In 1925, Barnes of the Centennial History of the American French Service Committee points out that when this ended, actually many of, or some of the American volunteers wanted to remain in Russia. And that was of great concern to J. Edgar Hoover and the intelligence that Quakers wanted to remain in Soviet Russia. So, but this was the work. This is where the AFSC and the work of the what became the French Service Council in Britain, in Russia and Germany, was what was especially cited in the Nobel Peace Prize citation. So I'm going to stop the share there and pass it on to David.
So it's just a tremendous pleasure to be here. And working on this book with Steve and Ben was just a joy. So I'm grateful for this event and grateful for this opportunity to work on this book. One of the things I'd like to do this morning is to make a few tentative observations about how the new history of Quakerism is different from other histories of Quakerism. To be clear, the new history of Quakerism can be a complicated term. It's a little like the term Band-Aid. So Band-Aid both refers, I have an audio-visual aid, to a particular product manufactured by Johnson & Johnson, but it also just refers to something you put on a wound. Similarly, I think I've heard the new history of Quakerism used to refer to just the way people are writing about Quakerism now, but which is an important topic. But today I'm just focusing on the narrow version of the new history of Quakerism. That is a way of referring to this 6-volume set, what will be a 6-volume set published by Penn State. And it'd be interesting to think actually about what ways the new history of Quakerism, the series, does and does not represent the new history of Quakerism more broadly. There's a real sense, I think, in which the people who produced the creation of modern Quaker diversity were working in the long shadow cast by a friend named Rufus Jones. Jones certainly ended up being one of the leading characters in the stories told by the people who wrote the book. There are, I believe, there are 13 chapters in the book, and I believe 12 of them discuss some aspect of Jones's life and work. And the number of references to be found to Jones in the book's bibliography far, far outstrips the number of references that can be found to any other figure in the bibliography. And again, in another context, or maybe later on today, it would be interesting to think about the pros and cons of focusing so much of our attention on Jones. Did saying so much about Jones keep us from drawing attention to the life and work of other people who deserve our attention? As it happens, Jones was the author of a book, The Later Periods of Quakerism, published, I believe, in 1921. Again, audiovisual aid, which covers many of the events that are discussed in the creation of modern Quaker diversity. And I think that exploring some of the differences between the creation of modern Quaker diversity, the volume edited by Steve Ben and I, and the later periods of Quakerism, a book which was written by Rufus Jones with the assistance of many other people, can shed some light on what makes the new history of Quakerism different. I say different, not better, because we're under no illusion that we've said the last word on the history of Quakerism. And our hope is that our work will be superseded. And we very much look forward to that happening. But for right now, what are some of the differences between the new history of Quakerism and as represented in our book and the later periods of Quakerism? Jones's book? Well, as Jones told it, the story of Quaker history was largely about friends under the leadership of the Holy Spirit coming to greater unity about their faith. So it's a story of unfortunate divisions being overcome. And as the title suggests, the creation of modern Quaker diversity tells maybe not an opposite story, but a very different story. Unsurprisingly, the creation of modern Quaker diversity does not have nearly as much to say about mysticism as Jones did in his work. I think it's not unfair to say that Jones believed that Quakerism had an essence and that mysticism was a part of that essence, or at the heart of the essence, perhaps. And I'm not sure that many or any of the authors of the creation of modern Quaker diversity are convinced that Quakerism has an essence. They're most concerned, I think, with heterogeneity, change from place to place and time to time, not searching for an essence. When he published his book in the early 1920s, Jones was sure that the future of Quakerism was liberal Quakerism. There was really no live option. And of course, that's not the way Quaker history looks now. So rather than present evangelical Quakerism as kind of a series of errors which led to blind alleys, our book emphasizes the tremendous creativity of evangelical Quakers. And then, of course, our book was written with the full knowledge that in some ways Jones got it exactly wrong. The percentage of the world's Quakers who are liberal is tiny. The percentage of the world's Quakers who are evangelical is huge. This leads us to another difference. Of course, the people who wrote this book were well aware of the fact that Quakerism was moving toward a religion whose strongholds were in the global South. And so although this book does not focus on the global South, it does pay special attention to the developments which would eventually lead to Quakerism's tremendous growth in Africa, South America, and Central America, among others. Related to that point is, I think, the creation of modern Quaker diversity makes a point of seeing Quaker history within the framework of the metaphorical and literal empires created by the United States of America and by the United Kingdom. There are certainly chapters in the book which suggest that you just can't understand the modern history of Quakerism without understanding how deeply intertwined it was with empires whose capitals were London and Washington, D.C. And I guess the final point I want to make, and this sounds like a criticism of our authors, but it's not. I think our book is derivative in a way that Jones's work was not. Jones just did not have a lot of scholarship, secondary works that he could rely on when he was coming up with his stories. So there's a great deal of research in the primary sources to be found in the later periods of Quakerism, but there just wasn't much of a secondary literature yet. And what I was struck with time and time again as we were editing this volume is how much our authors, very gifted people, were also relying on all sorts of other gifted scholars, some of whom are still working, some of whom have passed. But it is one of those, to use the cliche, it is one of those sitting on the shoulders of giants kind of book. We were the beneficiaries of decades and decades of very fine work. So I think that's all I have to say for right now. Thank you for letting me be a part of this event, and I look forward to comments and questions.
Thank you. I think we'll open it up for some comments or questions.
But we should address the people on the screen. If you want to ask a question, please raise the hand. And do you want to handle the question?
Yeah. Go ahead, Michael.
I'd like to observe that Jones not only wrote on Quaker history, he created 5 years meeting thoughts in a real way. You know, he was there through the development. He was on the discipline committee that produced the first unified discipline. He was on the executive committee continuously. He edited the 5 years meeting publication when that came out in 1912. And 5 years meeting was in many ways different from the very loose confederation of orthodox, non-conservative yearly meetings that it united. So in a way, I see his writing and his work, his telling of history, as explaining why the Quakerism he's involved in creating is a continuation. In the same way I see, say, Evans and Evans in their writings in the 1830s to 50s, when they defined Orthodox Quakerism as opposed to Hicksites. I don't know if this is a question, but how do you feel about that read?
Well, yeah, I think that's one reason why, and that's the main reason actually why Rufus Jones is mentioned in all but one of our chapters, is that he was involved in something.
Right, there is no.
He was setting up the American Foreign Service Committee.
Mhm.
He was liaising with British friends on the creation of Woodbrook and the creation of new Quaker peace testimony, testimony for peace rather than just one against the war, and he's doing that both before and after World War I. And you could extend the list. So yeah, Rufus Jones, born in 1863, outlives our book by 11 years, in 1948. So there'll probably be some references to him in the final volume. But very significant, all the ways mentioned.
You mentioned the mission work, and the question around empire was a piece of that introduction. I'm curious, in your work, how much is colonial, decolonial issues a factor in the analysis of the history?
You mean in terms of the writing?
Yeah. I mean, from any of the authors in general, I'm just curious, since that's mission work was obviously a significant piece of this, certainly of this period of time and later. Just curious.
A lot of the chapters really focus on the dual North Atlantic context of the
Right.
and UK, Britain. I think the point that Ben makes in his introduction and then gets carried through into a chapter on Quakers and Empire and Quakers and Mission is that firstly the Quakerism is becoming a global base, I mean one of the I think important works in this area, and I'm hoping we're bringing it to a wider audience, but Stanley Chagall Giza, talking, doing his work, looking at the agency of Kenyan friends, particularly his great grandmother, in terms of, Quakerism wasn't simply imposed by the missionaries, but also came, from the ground up. There's some very interesting work on Quakerism that is not, I think, referred to enough. But the actual origins of Quaker missions are, was kind of a challenge to take the next level of really sending out people in the global north for years, was when an Indian couple, an Indo-Portuguese couple, came and said, we started a new Quaker meeting in Calcutta. Well, how do they do that? Well, there were barrels of books that were sent from England, and they'd gotten hold of Robert Barclay's apology and said, well, that makes a lot of sense in the Indian context. So they innovated about that. And then when British Quakers sent missionaries to India, they ignored these people. They refused to really send missionaries who would connect with the Calcutta group. And one of the historians of missions, Ormer Greenwood, says, British friends who were evangelical at the time probably didn't want to deal with the messiness of trying to figure out, how to have a common Quakerism with a group that probably was more liberal than they were, and had come on Quakerism on their own with the help of Robert Barclay. So there's a lot going on in this volume. The chapter by Stephanie Midori Kamashin is really an intriguing one, because when talking about U.S. and British imperialism, we forget sometimes about Japanese imperialism. There you have an empire being constructed by people of color. So how do you understand that, and what you know, and the Toby has to deal with that, and you know, at a very high level, because he's a you know, diplomat, very a significant figure. And his responses were not always clear cut. There's a lot of ambiguity in terms of how he dealt with the Japanese Empire going into Manchuria and the events involved. Betsy.
Hi, I'm leaving my camera off because my connection seems to be really unstable when I have my video on. So sorry to be kind of a disembodied voice here. I obviously need to read the whole book. This is really exciting to have it. I'm part of the network of friends who are working on the Indian boarding school, Quaker involvement in the Indian boarding schools. And we keep running across things written by Quakers in the 1870s, 80s, 90s that reflect what I think of as casual scientific racism. That is just a running assumption that these people are inherently incapable of anything other than domestic labor, you know, physical labor. And I just wonder whether, you know, where in this consideration does that whole issue of white supremacy and white entitlement enter into the analysis of what Quakers were doing?
Ben, do you want to take that one? Well,
Sorry, I couldn't really hear very well.
question was, where in our analysis is the you know, Quaker involvement with white supremacy? You know, where do we deal with that and how?
You know, I could maybe get us started on that. I love the question. One of the things I tried to do in the afterword was to highlight the way Jones talked about people who were not of European descent in the later periods of Quakerism. And Betsy, it's his comments are often dismissive and denigrating, and just the ways your question suggests they might be. And of course, Jones's embroilment in the ideology and practices of white supremacy, and also his interest in eugenics, does not make him an outlier within the Quaker subculture. It makes him emblematic. And then I guess a particular question for those of us who are trying to write the history of Quakerism now has to do with how deeply we are indebted to the work that's in the Roundtree series and in publications such as that, which I would say do not resist and in many ways reinscribe the logic of white supremacy. It's not as if we're not deeply connected to that work and those assumptions, right? So given, let's say, for the sake of argument, that there are all sorts of white supremacist assumptions built into the Roundtree series, and let's go on to say that the Roundtree series has had an enormous effect on the way that scholars and other people think about Quakerism. Does that just mean wherever you look in Quaker studies or in Quakerism today, there are traces of white supremacy?
Ben, Wendy Michener writes in the chat, and I have not heard reference to Chuck Baker's 2 books, Remaking Friends and Angels of Progress, about the role of progressive friends in Quakerism. Is that movement discussed in the series? And Ben writes, Julie Holcomb's chapter mentions the progressive Quakers, but obviously not in the same depth as Chuck has. Yeah, meaning.
I have 2 comments, I think. And one of them kind of goes back to what you were talking about earlier. From the afterward, I had a really strong reaction to the part when you're talking about giving credit to a larger group of people for Joan's work than Joan gave credit for. And when you mentioned that he had domestic help and even named her name, called her name was Ada Smith, and recognizing that the work that she was doing for him allowed him the time to do it. And then, mentioning that he had said, my wife has been a true fellow laborer in this undertaking, but she was simply his wife. And for you to say her name was Elizabeth, I think particularly during the history of when this book was, the historical moment that this book was written, and then I guess also for a woman, that was just so meaningful that you acknowledged that he was able to do everything he does, or however we interpret it now, because he had this unpaid labor. Well, I mean, like with his wife, but you get it. So I really, really appreciated that. I also want to say I really loved how the book is put together, because for me, this is a really tricky, complicated history, and so many pieces, but because the layout of the book doesn't rely on a chronological acceptance of time or history, because it's taking different topics and looking at what happened through the view of those topics, I found it really easy to start connecting dots and putting pieces together, and things that may have seemed insignificant in one chapter all of a sudden had a completely different significance when I read it through the view of something else. So I loved the layout of this, or the organization of this.
Chuck, were you raising your hand?
I'm trying to, not finding a way to do it. I looked mainly at the chapter, I believe it's Joanna Dale's, that sort of covers the kind of the turn of the century. And I think it's very, very light on the whole development that we see now under the rubric of Friends General Conference. Its origins, its major influences, the major characters, they're almost, none of them are really mentioned of any consequence in any, and it's Rufus and the Brits, as far as I'm sorry, I haven't had time to give the chapter a close reading, but there was an awful lot going on among the Hicksites, and they had a difference. One of the main sort of differences in that community's life was that they did not seem to produce nearly as many people churning out books about it. Like, for instance, take Lucretia Mott, who I happen to think is a towering figure, and it says there, well, she didn't publish anything, and that's correct. However, there are 2 fat volumes of her speeches and sermons that have been preserved by people who came in and took them down, some to praise her and some looking for evidence to get her disowned. But nonetheless, there's a large body of material which has not hardly been studied really at all. But she was very, very influential, not only within Quakerism, but outside it as well. And then there were others. And it's Jesse Holmes, and even Jane Rushmore, although Jane Rushmore wrote tons, but it wasn't scholarly stuff. It was Sunday school stuff, mostly. And Jane Rushmore is another towering figure who is really very underappreciated. There is a biography of her, but it was done in the 50s while she was still alive, and there's lots more to be said. So I don't know who's going to pick this up the next one, because you got to 1930. I mean, Joseph DeGarmo published a book in the 1890s. He was raised a Hicksite, and he said the Hicksites were dying out. They were going to be gone in a few years, and he was writing their obituary. And a few years later, he reissued the book, and he made an apology, and he said, well, gee whiz, they didn't disappear. As a matter of fact, they seem to be resurgent. Well, yeah, there was a guy named sorry,
Henry Wilbur.
Henry Wilbur. You got it. Henry Wilbur. He was FGC's evangelist. He worked himself, I think this is no exaggeration, he worked himself to death evangelizing for Friends General Conference. And he made us a huge impact in preserving and advancing that as a viable movement into the 20th century. And by 1930, FGC had issued this thing called a letter to the scientifically minded, which was distributed nationwide. There was, I don't know, 30 or 40 or 50,000 copies of it that went around. It looks, I mean, I'm not saying it's a deathless piece of prose, but on the other hand, it was a very influential item. And so this is really, as far as I can tell, it's very, very faint in this story. In the chapter that I was able to look over, and I wish that there had been more, because there is a lot more. I have a feeling it's going to be a tougher kind of job for whoever your successors are, because there isn't this coterie of academics turning out stuff yet about it, not enough. Joanna Dales did a biography of John W. Graham. I read that, and I learned a lot from it, but it was very weak on what actually happened and what he did and said in his trips to the U.S. to visit with the U.S. Quakers. Well, of course, you know, hey, I'm in parochial. I want to know what he did in Swarthmore. He spent a year teaching at Swarthmore. The hell did he teach? Oh, it was about Quakerism. Well, great. That narrows it down, right? At least he wasn't saying mass. Okay. Same thing. Jonathan Plummer. Is he mentioned at all? Jonathan Plummer. He invented FGC. and held the first one in, is Waynesville, Ohio in your index? That's where the first Friends General Conference was held. It didn't get to the East Coast for almost 20 more years. And mainly it made it because Jonathan Plummer, I don't think he was a great intellectual, but evidently he was a really good salesman. And he managed to sell FGC to Eastern Quakers. At the first one, some folks came from Baltimore and they liked it. And they went home and they said, this is great. And so they set up the next one and they wanted Baltimore Yearly Meeting to send some people. Oh, no, they wouldn't want to send it. Good ideas don't come from places like Chicago, hick towns, you know. We're in Baltimore, right next door to Philadelphia. This is where things happen. So they wouldn't do it. And you know what? Plummer said, all right. He moved the location of the next one from, I think, Ohio to Baltimore. And he got a hall right across the street from where the Baltimore Hicksite Yearly Meeting was meeting. And folks reportedly streamed across. Oh, how many more reports do we want to hear from the elders, you know, instead of the lectures across the road from this new upstart outfit. And then eventually he managed to get to Philadelphia. I mean, it's a very interesting story, I think, but one which somebody's going to have to do some serious original work to do justice to it. And
so, Chuck, if you're saying that there's several specific movements and organizations and people to whom our book does not do justice, I would
that's
say
my impression, yes.
Yes, absolutely. And not just the ones you mentioned, but for virtually every chapter, there's a sense in which our treatment is superficial and inadequate. Because 280 pages seems like a lot of pages, but it's actually not a lot of pages to try to address all the fascinating things that happened between 1830 and 1937. So yes, I completely agree that there are ways in which our treatment of most topics is somewhat superficial. And I go on to say, given the nature of what we're trying to do, that was almost inevitable. But Ben and Steve, maybe I'm being too harsh on us. Maybe we're not as superficial as I say we are.
That's a generalization
I think
broader than I'm prepared to make, at least at
Chuck, we're gonna let that go.
I think there's a challenge for any author to balance the detail with the ideas. I think Joanna's very strong on the kind of theology that's going on, and maybe, as you say, is less involved in the detailed kind of then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. So, but I mean, luckily we have Doug Gwynn's history of FGC. So I think David's right that for anything that people want to dive into more deeply, either it is there or it certainly, as you suggest with Lucretia Mott, it needs doing. And as David said, hopefully we will be superseded. And I think the positive out of this is there is still so much wonderful research to be done and that needs to be done. We're trying in the volume we're writing now to be, I mean, here we are, 3 white men editing this. I mean, this isn't, great in and of itself. The volume we're working on now, we're trying particularly to bring in post-colonial perspectives. We're trying to bring in a wider authorship from different parts of the world. But yeah, I mean, our best efforts will fall short in time because there is so much more to know and such a bigger picture that can be expanded continually. And I don't think it's to put our effort down. It's just to say we need to be realistic about what we were trying to achieve. And I mean, the question about the progressives, obviously, anyone who wants to look at the progressives would head to your volumes, Chuck. We wouldn't expect, a book like ours to be able to carry so much detail.
If your next one is going to go to 2018, is that the year I heard for the span? I expect to hear from you because your event horizon, I don't see how it can avoid paying significant attention to the widest and deepest set of divisions since 1827, which was not finished until 2018.
And remains unfinished. So yeah.
Yes, it remains unfinished, but nonetheless, there was a series of earthquakes and fractures that I just, it would be it would certainly not be worth a tenth of the $150 that they're going to charge for it if it doesn't include that. And that'll be work too.
The press imposes page limits too. And we ran over last time. The next one will be a shorter volume. So that just reinforces David's point. I don't want to belabor that. Yeah, Ben.
Yeah, a somewhat different point. Maybe it would also point into the next volume. I was late to this because I was on the phone with friends, small F, capital F, and thinking about going there and talking about some of the questions that I see that flow from this conversation. And I guess it involves that question of the cross currents created by colonialism and empire over time. And part of the way I see that, part of the way that comes up is in Bolivia, and I think in most of the global South, the missionaries are quite conservative, evangelically informed Quakers who, at least for Bolivia is the one that I know best at this point, range between what I would call sort of the sweet spot of American evangelicalism logically to something that looks much more like mid-century fundamentalism. And those groups that missionized them largely departed by the mid-60s. And the people who have come since have been sort of more informed by sort of a liberal mission for justice and peace in the world kind of Quakerism that have also come with a different theology, and that will, although I call myself a grateful guest among friends, will include me and my students who will come into contact with these much more theologically conservative folks, and that raises questions of colonialism then, but also colonialism now, right? I mean, so as we come there and realize that there are significant theological differences between us and them, but realize that they have their theology because of the previous era of colonialism. There's a question of like, who are we now to say otherwise? So I'm curious, I don't know. It may be best for Steve to recommend me further reading on that because that may be too downstream from your current work. But I'm curious if you have an ability to speak to that question of going to the people whose more conservative theology reflects an early era of colonialism.
I have a piece of advice. At Quaker Hill, the Global Ministries Coordinator was born in Guatemala, is indigenous Guatemalan, and came to the Friends movement because her parents were Friends ministers in Guatemala. She is the first Global Ministries Director who was born on the mission field to an indigenous family indigenous to the place. You want to talk about this dynamic? Talk to her.
What's her name?
Carla. Name's
Oh,
Carla.
okay, yeah, okay, let's start.
Yeah, she's the head of FUM's missions.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Now, obviously, there's a lot more that we could do on every topic in this book. And that's the problem with every. And it's clearly our hope, as both David and Ben said, that we will spark more scholarship. You know, so.
Hope so, as they would say in Britain. We approve.
Any closing thoughts from either David or Ben, Steve?
Okay, so I think one of the things we tried to do in this volume was as Steve said, we went for particular topics and then we approached different people to see if they would fulfill that. And I think that's one of the tensions in this volume, is that we've tried to be encyclopedic and yet within the parameters of a fairly short book. I mean, Rufus Jones took 2 volumes over the later periods. So I think that is a tension. I think there's still an ongoing tension about how far it still privileges the global north and scholars working in the global north. But obviously, and I'm not just saying this as an editor, but I do feel it's still a very worthwhile and important volume, as I think the series is as well. The next volume, we've not tried to be encyclopedic. We've actually, in the certain things we know we need to cover, but we've also followed the pattern that Robin Healy has used in her volumes of saying, well, where's the latest scholarship that's happening in this area? And I do want to reinforce that idea of scholarship, because, I mean, as David said, Rufus was building on very little, but he was also really writing a denominational history. I mean, that's not what we're about in the new history of Quakerism. We're trying to bring together the finest academic insights, wherever they come from, into the discussion and debate around academic Quaker studies. We hope also it may be useful for friends, but that's not our primary intent. And so I think that does give us a different kind of project in hand. But it also leads to another tension where a lot of the people reading these books will be Quakers and not necessarily finding the kind of material that they may want to see there. I would also just like to say also what a great privilege and joy it has been to work with my co-editors. So, thanks.
Thank you, friends. Are there any stimulus? Thank you so much for coming. We hope to keep these discussions going. Thank you.